Well, if I could have shown one slide to Trump, it would have been this one. Because, I mean, yes, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been going up and down on a 100,000-year cycle for a long time, but all of a sudden, it's into new territory. And this is why we're in trouble. Who's put it all up there? Well, the US has put up a lot. Right now, China's putting up more, but cumulatively, we put up the most. India's starting to put up a lot and so on. You can see the chart here. It's pretty obvious. Now, this was a real shock when Paul Hawken wrote this book, Drawdown. The way air conditioners are designed and built, they produce a lot of CO2, and that's easily dealt with, and we're dealing with it. We know wind turbines are great. Reduced food waste is a big, big, big deal. Food waste creates a lot of CO2. And eating less meat, particularly beef and pork, I've sworn off both, really helps. Number 6 was the biggest shocker of all, educating girls. Why in the hell would that have any impact? It's because they have fewer children and therefore fewer people to produce CO2 over time, followed by family planning and solar farms. If you add rooftop solar, number 10, and solar farms, actually, it's right up there with wind. But number 6 was a shocker. I just moved from Michigan back to Seattle, but this shows you under different emission scenarios how the climate's going to change. Michigan will be like North Texas in a high emission scenario. Oh, I forget the time scale on this. Oh, mid-century, end of century. This is dramatic. It's happening. And weird weather, we know about more severe storms, weather events. Global weirding, as Tom Friedman calls it, is probably better than global warming. Storm surges we've known about and experienced for a long time, they've gotten worse, but sunny day flooding in places like Miami, where the water comes up through the sewer, not over the beach, is pretty dramatic, with huge rainstorms and dramatic damage, in this case, Florida. Remember Superstorm Sandy, the suburb? This is a subway stop. Our beloved Venice, underwater, it floods a lot more. This is the increase in heavy rainfall. The country is getting wetter and wetter and wetter. In a 5-year period, 2008 to 2013, Chicago had 3 so-called 100-year floods, ones that should happen every 100 years. Houston had 3 500-year storms. It's getting wetter faster. So we know about mitigation, wind and solar and so on. Adaptation is a little more complex, fortifying, defending, accommodating, retreating, cleaning up, and so on. Mitigation is associated with the term sustainability. I remember when I first got out of college, we were talking about energy, the energy crisis, which is when I started building passive solar houses back in New Jersey. And then it evolved to sustainability, and now it's more and more about resilience, which is more about adapting to climate change, as people like Andre Stawani are pushing hard now. I think Liz was originally going to be on this panel, but she couldn't make it. Liz Plater-Zyberk. Some of those great drawings by Diru Tidani. Mitigation is also using light-colored surfaces like white roofs. They now just announced in the last 3 days, I think, a new white paint, which is considerably more reflective, sometimes called albedo enhancement. White roofs are great. Higher reflectivity or solar reflectivity index. It doesn't necessarily, in fact, it typically doesn't cool the building under the roof because roofs are well insulated now, but it cools the neighborhood down. And it's having an impact. Students I know from my alma mater, Princeton, are going up to New York City and painting roofs white. Big, Park Engel's remarkable firm talks about adaptation or adapting at the sort of civic scale, lower Manhattan, but there's also sort of personal adaptation as shown in this apothecary in Venice. Algae that smelled so bad people had to leave town. In Florida, that's a big deal. It's a big deal in Lake Erie, too, not far from Michigan, where I lived. So the greenest building is one that's already built. You know about the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. And don't forget refurbish, repair, repurpose. We need to focus on this. That would not apply, obviously, yet to Carmel, but it ultimately will. I had the pleasure of doing a tour of Namibia, and this was one remarkable recycling habitat center where tires were used to build a building. This is silica plastic block, sustainable brick made from recycled sand and plastic waste. We need to do more of this. This is brand new. It's a digester that employs mealworms to eat styrofoam. We need more of this. It's a lot of styrofoam. I threw some away this morning from my food container. It's about valuing the future. Chris Lomberger's talked about this, not discounting it. Discounted cash flow and all that has tended to devalue the future. It's not the way they thought in the Middle Ages. These buildings were built to last in perpetuity, and many of them, as you know, have stood and will stand for a very long time. The people who built these didn't live to see the end of the construction. These were multi-generational enterprises, efforts, for which the world is much richer. So new urbanism brought us, a new attitude towards transportation networks. The gridded neighborhood took over to a large extent, as Chris and others have explained, from cul-de-sac development, which requires a lot of driving, contributing vehicles, but not real road capacity. This was a major contribution of new urbanism, where endless spatial spread gave to finite places like the famous seaside, which I hope you can go to if you haven't been there. It's about finite place versus sort of endlessness. Pedestrian pocket, a charrette organized at the University of Washington, I think, late 80s. Calthorpe, who was there, and along with some other people, names you'd know, later changed it to TOD, Transit-Oriented Development. Probably a better term than pedestrian pocket. But it all started at an academic charrette, and since every planner on the planet knows what a TOD is. Estimates for the US suggest that transit-oriented urban development could reduce per capita use by as much as 50%, reducing household expenditures by 20% at significantly lower fuel. Even at our much lower fuel prices here in the United States, sprawling Houston spends about 14% of its GDP on transport compared to 4% in Copenhagen, a city I've lived in and come to really admire. And I think we've got a person or two here from Copenhagen. Unfortunately, Peter Emlin and Tigran Haas could not make it from Sweden. I think the Transect, which is sort of a mindlessly simple idea, has had a positive impact on the way we think about and build cities, and we can thank new urbanism for that. Retrofitting sprawl is tough. these subdivisions are going to be hard to connect up and, become mixed use and so on, denser. It's possible, but this is a major challenge for upcoming generations, including our own. Affordable housing we've talked about. I did a major study for the state of Washington many, many years ago and concluded that the low-hanging fruit was ADUs, whether they're attached or separated or in the front or the back or whatever. I think they're really, really important as a way to provide affordability. Will always be an ongoing problem. It's a supply and demand problem, as Chris said, but land, which they're not making any more of, is going up. It's the main driver. I had the pleasure of cycling yesterday on the Mona Trail, and I love this counter where they count cyclists and pedestrians. Really impressive. And I was impressed with Midtown, the architecture, the public space, active public realm, wonderful ping pong tables, and so on and so forth. And architecture that seemed real, with real brick and real honesty, as opposed to this picture, which I took out my hotel window this morning and debated last night with the mayor and some others, this faux, fake, false architecture that I think is Carmel's Achilles heel, its weak spot. Unlike this building, which is built of real stone, too many buildings have fake components, like this steel mansard roof, which isn't even complete. I don't know if someone fell down or what, but I mean, and these fake keystones and drive it and balconies you can't use. I think this is the weak spot, and I'm happy to discuss that later. I think that's it for me. This is my latest book on sale here, signed copies. There are not a lot left. I'm happy to sign a copy if you'd like to buy one. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Doug. So many challenges and so many things that we all need to be responding to in not only in our own areas of expertise, but as collaborators, as building networks of collaboration and understanding of how we move forward on these things. So the next thing we're going to do is something that we've decided to do a couple of times during the conference, and that is to bring in some of the folks, especially the international folks, who have been unable to travel to join us personally. And one of the people who's been unable to travel is our good friend Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, who is a co-founder of the Congress for the New Urbanism and just a legendary figure in the field. Many of you know her work or know her personally. And as Doug was alluding to Seaside, she is a co-planner with her husband and partner, Andres Tuani. So let's try to see if the video is going to work, and then we'll have a few remarks after that. I'm speaking with Liz Plater-Zyberk, who has for many years been a pioneer of the New Urbanism, a co-founder of the Congress for the New Urbanism with Andres Tuani, her partner and husband. And Liz has been certainly a leader in transforming the suburbs in places like Carmel, which is where we are at this conference, looking at what your old colleague Jeff Speck and others have done there. Liz, there are a lot of people interested in this moment in history, and as we're too slowly maybe emerging from the pandemic. And you have been involved with Andres for many, many years working on retrofitting urban development for a new model, a new kind of development that is more oriented to human beings rather than to the automobile. And so what are your thoughts about this time in history? What our opportunities are, what our challenges are coming out of the pandemic?
Well, I think we've all been called to attention, so to speak, on three worldwide topics in a way that we've also been asked to imagine more than ever before a shared world. And the pandemic, I think, was the clear call of shared experience. But it reminded us that climate change has been in the wings, if not in the forefront for many people. Right. And then, of course, the social justice issues, which really became very present, right, for more people than ever last year.
Well, you guys are really dealing with the climate issue there in Miami, I know, and you've been involved a lot in flood adaptation and other work.
Yes, so of course in South Florida, we're very much aware of potential and imminent impacts. And in fact, we've measured rising water levels due to sea level rise.
Well, you were involved for a number of years, I guess, in the Hurricane Andrew work early on, and then later, of course, with Hurricane Katrina. What do you see as the lessons from that we can apply today?
You're right, Michael. A number of us in our world of the new urbanism have been involved in response to catastrophes. So it's not just about laying down a plan for people to move into, and it's not easy to lay down a plan for people to leave.
Right.
And so we have some lessons to be learned from the Rust Belt. There are very interesting issues of finance, the cleaning up. I've got a whole sequence that I lay out in the course that I teach. And it really requires cross-disciplinary work. Now, you have an audience who's probably less concerned about that, which I think for most people seems to be far in the future. And you're thinking probably more about, well, what about the next 5 years? Or
and how do you do it? What are the tools and the strategies to actually drive change, make positive change for suburbs? Well, earlier we were talking about this, and you noted that sometimes the big, sort of mega projects are not so easy to accomplish. You have so many political factors, opposition and financial hurdles and everything else, that maybe we need to focus a little more on the smaller adaptations and the toolkit approach.
Exactly. So is that something that is just common sense? Don't use so much paving in order to make room for water. There are very specific things like that I think. Recently, I was reading about community forests where communities start managing the surrounding wildland in order to protect their community, since it's more than the federal or state government can manage. And so they take it on, in a sense, themselves to say, we're going to start the burns. And even though it doesn't belong to us, that's one way of protecting ourselves. So I think we're going to see some very interesting local and regional approaches.
Well, we did a project, I don't know if you saw it when we did the Gentili project in New Orleans with Andres and the other team there. Part of it was reclustering the homes around new open spaces, new squares, basically. So not very big spaces, but trying to recreate an urban pattern out of the hodgepodge of empty houses and so on.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things about the past year is that people kind of wheeled into action. Pivot was a word that was used a lot. And even communities, you read about the mayors who went out and bought the tables and chairs for the restaurants to be able to move out into the parking spaces of the street. And so it may be that kind of thing that we could be thinking of as some of the adaptations.
Right. In Europe right now, there's an effort to try to assemble toolkits and things that local communities can use. Many people seem to be thinking along parallel lines to try to get more fine-grained resources for local action and local change at the scale of homes and neighborhoods rather than cities and regions. One of the interesting things about the IMCL conference, as I've been thinking about and talking to you and others, this idea of livability is something that really reaches people on a immediate level. My quality of life, if I'm flooded out of my home, it's obviously not a livable home. But if I can understand why change is good for me, good for my neighborhood, good for my town, then I can respond to that in a way that maybe I'm not going to respond if it's a theoretical concern about something that might happen in 10 or 20 or 50 years. So maybe we can leverage what we all know is, from a policy point of view, an important agenda, but connect it to the personal and the local in a way that is maybe a positive thing on many levels.
Well, I think that's probably the first kind of action that makes sense, because it can engage people where it's most relevant for them, close to home.
Right.
And where probably the immediate action is needed.
There's also the question of the quality of the human environment. And one of the things that we're learning, I think, is that the economics of a community is tied to its quality of place and quality of livability. And many communities are struggling not only with weather and climate and other things, but also economic disruptions, profound disruptions to their industries and their way of life. And they're trying to reinvent themselves in some way. And what I find fascinating is the way that people are connecting the dots, so to speak, between creating a place that's attractive and livable and desirable to live, and a place where you can attract new businesses and new enterprises, and a sort of ecology of economic innovation and activity. And I see that in a number of communities around the US and Europe, where they're, former shrinking cities or declining industrial cities that are finding new ways to reinvent themselves. It's quite fascinating. What are you seeing along those lines?
I think certainly we are seeing that. Right now, there are questions in people's minds about the very dense, high-value cities, right. Manhattan, San Francisco. We have challenging livability issues related to homelessness. But I do think that some of the tactical things we did in the last year offer great hope. Streets being redirected, lanes being repainted, the use of public space.
Reclaiming, the street as a public space.
Some of the work that's being done with land trusts, I think, is a way, and in which case I think the Europeans are way ahead of us on these different kinds of ownership scenarios, but certainly the land trusts as ways to try to maintain workforce and affordable housing in the place that it always has been.
As you say, the Europeans are ahead of the Americans in many ways, but the converse is true too on some of our financial mechanisms, for example, a tax increment financing. And this to me is really the goal for the IMCL, is to have this international conversation, international exchange and cross-fertilization. One last topic I'd love to you touched on it earlier, which is the sort of over-concentration in the dense cities, the high prices, and the creative class, which is very powerful economically, as we can see, but it's also has a very dark side, as Richard Florida and others have pointed out. And it seems to me that we're re-examining the role of the suburbs, not as bedrooms, but as real urban places, right? Yeah. And it seems to me you guys have been working on that for a number of years now, right?
Yeah.
So one of our big themes, certainly the theme this year, is about looking at the suburbs, cities and suburbs for all, and the idea that we need polycentric settlements. It's not just about the city cores. The suburbs and the exurbs have a place, but not as these sort of monolithic bedroom communities, but as real urban places. And I know I'm telling you something you've been evangelizing your whole life practically, but.
And, it's interesting that we're talking about this right now after reading an article just yesterday in our local paper about how Miami has been transformed to a city of walkable, appealing centers in which now people want to live close to the economic activity of those centers. When we first came to Miami, there was probably not one place that you would find an apartment or a residence where you could just walk out and find lots of things.
Wow.
Walking. And now we probably have dozens. And it has to do with retrofitting. Yes, this idea, which now is being touted as the 15-minute city.
Right.
And of course, there's the question, 15-minute on foot or on bicycle or
transit or car.
Yeah, that is the trajectory, of course. But this idea that our metropolitan areas might be made of many centers that can focus daily life and make daily life more livable, especially close to home.
Well, Liz, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I know everybody is delighted to get your thoughts on the current historical moment. And we look forward to seeing you in Miami, or perhaps next year we're going to do a conference in Paris. So please come to the Paris conference. And
well, that's very appealing.
Well, it's wonderful to have her join us, even if by video. I guess the birds also wanted to chime in there. They were very, very active as well. So lots of great stuff to think about there as well. Michael Lykoudis is, many of you may know, the former dean of the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture, just up the road here. By the way, wonderful exhibit of some of the student work in the mezzanine of the lobby there that you can look at. And interestingly enough, Michael and Liz and Doug are all former deans of architecture programs. You know, the IMCL is not really focused on architecture as much as some other conferences. We're much more focused on the research side of things in many disciplines. We're focused on the policy side of things with mayors and senior planners, many of yourselves in those roles. But it is interesting that we have three former deans, two of whom will be joining us in the panel. And we can talk, I think, about how we're understanding the changing role of the professions, not only architecture, planning, others as well. And I know Michael Lykoudis has spent a lifetime thinking about these issues and thinking about how the quality of place, the quality of our own environment, the edge of the public space is not only the spaces themselves and not the buildings as objects, but as places, and placemaking plays such a central role. So please welcome Michael Lykoudis.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you to everyone who came here today, and our first of many conferences to come, but the first one after 15 long months. The title of the session is a new academic design agenda. And I'm going to actually show you a project that my students did about a year ago that had to do with wildfires, climate change. It's in Greece, and I'll explain a few things about it before I show it to you. But schools of architecture actually have to do everything they used to do. You know, all the issues of composition, the struggle for beauty, a sense of place, you know. And to all of that, we have to add social equity, climate change, resilience. I guess that goes to climate change. We also have to deal with an environment that also through artificial intelligence slowly seeps away at the perceived need for the physical fabric of the world, and all too often determines on its own merits and its own systems what we need and what we see. And if cities are the places where democracies ought to flourish, I think that there are many questions to be raised, not only about climate change, which is the singular biggest existential threat, but also the technological advances that have, or perhaps not, that have really attacked our institutions, and how we harness them and how we bring them back to make them more democratic and to serve justice, serve humanity and the world, the entire world. We also have to promise a future, and we cannot really do that without the time-honored attributes of durability, functionality, and beauty. I mean, those things haven't really changed. We do have to replace the Howard Rourke model of the architect genius and the way we support it in schools to teamwork. And that's what the students found when they did this project in Mati, Greece. They had to work as a team to kind of disentangle them from their egos. The urban design, they all split up into teams. They did this idealized designs of different teams, and then nothing worked. It was completely unusable. And then we gave them each a quadrant. So each student designed a quadrant of the village. And then they took each other's designs and redesigned them. And then we just kept moving around until we actually got a plan that had clarity in terms of its typological intent, but also didn't belong to any particular student. There was a moment for the students to do their own thing later, and you'll see that. The other big issue is what we do with global and local. You know, for the first time in the history of the world, we really see ourselves as living downwind from each other. That beautiful image taken from the backside, from the moon's horizon, seeing Earth by itself, points us to our common fate, and that how we all must work together. At the same time, we also have to build communities that are scaled small enough so we feel like we're in control of them, and that we can contribute. Our lives will matter in the development of that community, either as architects or as shop owners or as whatever we choose to work with. So this project is actually all about the above. It's about a little village that was originally agricultural land, and then became abandoned and pine forests grew. It's actually termed an urban area, even though before the fire it was all of pine forests. And about how people live in nature with rustic, the vernacular, and monumental buildings. So the DNA of the city and its architecture, even though cities have their own particular histories, own particular identities, we can look at lessons that can be taken from all over the world, that we, as architecture schools, cannot just teach architecture, we have to teach about cities and their buildings. And the things that cities have mostly in common at the urban scale are streets, squares, and blocks. Not all cities have squares, but almost every city, village, and hamlet has a street and a block. That the urbanism engages the architecture at the building topological level, and we have public buildings that look like they're public buildings, private buildings that look like they're private buildings, and sacred buildings that look like they're sacred buildings in almost any culture. Any one of us can go to another culture and we'll be pretty good at identifying which buildings fit in what category. And finally, the last piece of the DNA of cities and their architecture are walls, openings, and roofs. We're public creatures with private needs. Walls keep our privacy to private. Openings modulate the private realm to the public realm. You know, a door, a window, a door, a colonnade, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But all of these are about urbanism. They're all about the city. In this next few decades, we'll have to figure out how to build these cities with less petroleum products, from the insulation of waterproofing to how we transit through the cities. Okay, now I'll turn to Mati. In July of 2018, the town or the community of Mati experienced a terrible fire. Over 100 people died. As I said before, it was a lush pine forest. Low-level pines don't have illusions of Colorado alpine forests, but the short, stubby pine trees that are common to Greece and the Mediterranean. And the fire just raced across the town, destroying almost everything. A few months after the fire, I got a call from the Prince of Wales, who suggested that I, as being of Greek ancestry, should look at Matti, which is something I was actually already doing. But with his encouragement, I decided that maybe I could do a studio on this or lead a studio. So in July of 2019, I took a group of 9 students to Matti just to explore and just to see what was there. And we did some design work when we came back, but really couldn't do anything until we met with the townspeople to get their feelings about what they imagined. The governments to that point had been completely incompetent, completely disinterested in doing anything for Matti. But when I wrote the new Prime Minister, Prime Minister Mitsotakis, he responded within a week and with excitement and thrills that we were actually interested in doing this. So these are the names of the students who all participated in a rather wonderful dance that they had to discover, sometimes painfully, about how to interact with each other and how to let go of their ideas and accept others. So Matti is where the red dot is, obviously. There's Greece on the left, Attica, which is the prefecture that Athens and its environs sit in, and again, Matti is in the red dot. It is 30 kilometers from Athens, so it's kind of an exurb, and it started out as a kind of vacation spot, but is now, it's all year round with beautiful beaches, beautiful views, and you can see the kind of landscape, if you will, on the extreme right. This is Matti before the fire, and I want to thank my colleague Fivos Sargentis for having created a series of slides that show the fire and the after effects. He's with the Polytechnic of Athens. He worked with us in the initial stages of the project, but you can see how beautiful and discreet and intimate these beaches are. You can also see how the landscape is very rustic. The connection between the upper level of the town and the beach is tenuous. The infrastructure is very poor, so one of the things we would do is to actually improve that. So the fire began around on the 23rd of July in 2018. Matti is called Matti, it means eye in Greek, because these strange geological formations around the town create a kind of cyclonic wind pattern resembling an eye, like the eye of a hurricane. And that particular day, the winds were blowing particularly hard, not unlike the Santa Ana winds in California. And the temperatures approximated about 100 degrees. At the same time that the fire was beginning to brew in Matti, another fire in the town of Kineta on the west side of Attica, the prefecture that Athens sits as well, also started. So all the aircraft that were, the water bombers that were going to be potentially helping Matti had already been diverted to the other place, as well as many of the other resources. So Matti was kind of out there on its own. And the fire began around 5, a little bit before 5. And spread quickly. This is 5:45. That's about a kilometer and a half. By 6, yes, by 6 o'clock it had moved to that point. And of course, by 6:45, it had engulfed the entire town. Some quick images, the horror there. People fled to the water. Some people had to jump off of a cliff. Some people died in a fire from smoke inhalation, from burning, and also from diving into the cliff. The traffic jams because of the unacceptable exits from the city, from the town, resulted. You can still see the fossils of the cars in the pavement. So about 560 acres, 100 people died. This is our first look at the town. This is our own survey, what was saved, what buildings were saved, what was totally destroyed, what could be saved. And we made 5 main principles. That we would create fire protection perimeters around the town with reinstalling some agricultural land using the military installations, enhancing egress, both vehicular and pedestrian, breaking down the block sizes to make a more fluid transit through the town, and visible gates to exit. Also fire breaks within the town, and this is the main lesson. We also introduced a vegetation plan to reduce the flammability from the potential fires. Also fire alert systems and things like that. So this is the 5-year plan. We didn't want to make interventions that would affect people too much initially, but the idea was to begin to break down the street patterns. There were very, very long blocks, and you can see our additions of our city, of our streets where there were places of least resistance. Buildings had burned that was between property lines. And we also inserted fire refuge areas, large paved areas. A fire station is where the number 1 is. And along the waterfront, several areas of refuge and gates that would help protect the residents. We replaced many of the pine trees with other non as flammable trees, carob trees, myrtle trees, olive trees, plane trees on the western side where the wettest part of the site is, where the arroyos come down and fill that area with water in the winter. And in the 75-year plan, we just simply complete the street grid, add the vehicular and pedestrian exits with greater clarity and greater wayfinding. And we also created the several urban firewalls, one east-west in about the middle part of the site, and one on the coastal side, so that if the fire was to break out, that those firewalls would actually prevent or slow down the fire from spreading too quickly. That's the northern fire protection zone, the western one with vineyards, and the eastern one and by the water, and the wall, the urban wall, which protects the entire coastal path, and the central boulevard firewall. Turns out that the best fire-resistant urbanism is traditional urbanism, where you have zero lot line construction and walls in the lots, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm just gonna, these are some of the public spaces that we designed, again, with fire resistance in mind and areas of refuge. This is the path, the one that you saw earlier in the slide with the lush pine. We added these gates as wayfinding devices, starting with the most rustic character on the outer parts of the community and getting a little bit more monumental as you got to the center. These would be augmented with strobes and acoustic alarms so that you could actually find your way to there. The pathway on the coastal road would be augmented and have permanent steps and access to the beaches so that, excuse me, so that you could not trip and fall and kill yourself should you have to escape a fire. But this is not all about the fire. It's also the public amenity to make those beaches much more accessible. I won't read that poem, but it was an important break between the urbanism and the architecture. It's a poem of George Sephardius, the Nobel laureate of Greece in the 50s. Somebody is interested, I can share it with you later. This is the fire station done by Andrew Sego. I think he captured the neoclassical vernacular of Greece, particularly the 19th and early 20th centuries, quite elegantly. Part of this was to try to create a sense of place, a place that they knew, but also one that spoke of a future. This is one of the wineries by Kasia Pachinska. One idea was that the wine could be made so that it could be sold and the proceeds could go to help the town of Mati, and that's where the circle is where that winery is located. Another winery to the north would serve the same purpose. This is by Diana Nasco. We had quite an international group of students. We had people from Asia, from Europe, from the Americas, all working on this project. And invariably, while the architectural projects are of the students' designs, the urban design was really a team effort. The public pool was also an escape pier. You can see how it juts into the water. That was, yep, I will wrap up. That was if I could just see the last few slides, the hotel. That's another hotel. And the hotels are also designed to be fire breaks for the, so the architecture and the urbanism all contributed to a sense of place, a fire-resistant architecture, and reintroducing a discussion about how all those criteria can return to the discussion in Greece. So these are the places we visited: Nafplion and Spetses by Dimitri Porphyrios. This is Nafplion, and that's Spetses, and that's. Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and start out with one question, and maybe this is for Chris, but others can jump in as well. How close does parking need to be to the activity centers? You know, parking is such a challenge. Form follows parking, right? How do we deal with that, and how do you deal with a place that's been historically car-centric?
Well, we all know that transportation drives development. That's why we have secretaries of transportation and not secretaries of sewers or secretaries of power. So, you know, and that's been 10,000 years of building cities. Transportation drives development. And in a drivable suburban world, that means parking drives what you can build. And so you must, it's a necessary evil, and therefore you are going to have decked parking. And when you build a surface parking lot, ignoring land cost, that the cost of a surface parking is about $1,000, $2,000 per stall. When you deck the parking, go above ground, and you have natural ventilation, it's $25,000 to $30,000 per stall, so a tremendous jump up. And then you put it underground, and it's $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 per parking space. So huge jumps in price. So you can obviously phase in getting the parking close to where the activity is, because you don't build everything out in one day. You can have some transitional surface parking that will eventually get built upon, and the parking goes into parking decks, again, either above ground or underground. But once you get to parking decks, either above ground or underground, you must have a shared parking system. So much of this comes back to management. And so shared parking becomes key to use the parking during the day for, say, office space for 5 days per week. Then at night, it will be for entertainment. That's why arenas and movie theaters work so well with office-dominated places, because the parking's not used at night and on weekends when most of the entertainment activities take place. And then, of course, residential. You've got a liability question. We were talking about that last night. But we have to find a way to use that parking space 2, 3, 4 times per day so as to amortize the cost, that increased cost of parking. So you got to deal with it. And eventually, when we get to transit-oriented development, I mean, here, Carmel will get transit someday, and you'll begin to have that parking ratio decline. But you're going to have to, accommodate that parking, probably at 2 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet. But the goal is to get the parking under 1 parking space per 1,000 square feet. And ideally, you'll be building buildings with 0 parking in the future.
I'm going to add on to that just a little bit, because I think part of what the question was asking also was just what's the appetite for people walking in a suburban environment, but that is trying to be retrofitted. And obviously parking's a big deal, but it depends on the quality of that walk. So if you are walking past parking space, surface parking, yeah, people want to park as close as possible. If you actually want to support your retail and make a lively streetscape that really has abundant life on it, you want people to walk 1 block, 2 blocks. And that increasingly decoupling the parking from the immediate front door and the immediate use has all sorts, and we're seeing that happening. It only happens where the walk has been made a comfortable walk.
Well, Ellen, doesn't walk score now include the quality? I believe Scott Bernstein it includes the quality of the walk, not just the length.
They're constantly triggering those, re-triggering jiggering those algorithms.
Yeah, walk score, which I've been on the board of when it was independent before it was bought by Redfin. They've been talking about it. I don't think they have gotten that level of sophistication yet, but you're exactly right. And certainly Chris Nelson and I have had an ongoing debate. Walking distance used to be a quarter mile, but then he says, the data is showing that when it becomes a more interesting walk, it very quickly becomes half mile, 1 kilometer.
I had a walk score of 99 in Ann Arbor. I was sorry to leave that for Seattle, but not only was the walk score good, the bike score was good. I mean, I could do virtually everything on foot or on bike.
Well,
let me throw a question out here about parking, because I think that's really one of the hardest things about retrofitting a suburb is how you design for people yet accommodate those cars. We've all read about autonomous vehicles. We're supposedly going to be able to call a car on our phone and it will drive itself to us in a few years. So now we've spent, Carmel's case, sometimes $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 parking space for underground garages, maybe $30,000 or $40,000 for garages that are surrounded by buildings. I'd like to throw out to the panel, what do we do with those buildings once we're no longer have to store the cars in the high rent district? What comes next?
Well, I think you mentioned, Mayor, that some parking garages are built to be adaptable. It's difficult, though, because they have big floor plates. It's hard to get daylight into parking garages. So I sort of have to question the ability to adapt parking garages.
I think actually, if the ramps are put in the middle, they're easily, that gets
helps.
removed, you get a courtyard. The bigger challenge is actually just getting enough steel put in. The loads and the ceiling heights. It's a lot more expensive to build a retrofittable garage.
And you need ramps. You can't have the sloping floors,
Right.
obviously.
You need removable ramps, but they're happening in a few places. I know your staff, Mayor, is working on making retrofittable garages. Mostly right now, that we still have, before we get to retrofitting the garages, we've got so many surface parking lots. Job one is build on top of the existing surplus.
And what I would add to that is for new projects, I think there's a number of really great projects where the parking is integrated into the same structure, below, wrapped around, and so forth. I think increasingly, to amplify the point Ellen made previously, we want to decouple the parking from the project. So it may be that we need more standalone parking structures so that in a kind of neighborhood where there are multiple blocks and separate buildings, that then they could be taken down and replaced without having to kind of rethink the whole building. So in fact, having the structured parking be separate structures.
Mayor, I would like to say something about autonomous vehicles, because at the University of Michigan, being near Detroit and so on, there's a huge amount of research about that. And frankly, they're pretty skeptical about autonomous vehicles. I think it's a long ways off. Electric vehicles, though, are here and are fabulous.
I also would argue that for new build, design if you have to build a parking lot today, because that's really where we still are, design it to be a future building site. Don't put the utilities diagonally underneath just to go to the closest sewer hookup. Put your utilities in the drive lanes that are going to be the future streets. And even Walmart agrees to do that. It's really, so plan
That's
out
shocking
that
Walmart
future.
would be that smart.
They do. We've got the case studies.
We've had a couple of questions sent into the app, and they deal with affordability, and specifically one of them was with elevators. And Do they, will people walk up 3 levels? You have to put elevators everywhere. But, I think it goes back to supply and demand issue, but as we start to build walkable pedestrian areas, they're very popular. How do you keep the price affordable?
So on the elevator issue, there's a number of different strategies. You can do stacked townhouses that you actually don't need elevators because of the type of units. But once you're getting into, the 4-story single floor plate connected, you have to have elevators. And that is what is driving then that most new apartment buildings are very large. They're almost single block apartment buildings. It's not an unreasonable way to make relatively affordable housing, often wrapping the parking deck. And that's very, very, very common.
There is some rethinking about elevators, though. Some of the buildings in Seattle now encourage walking up the stairs, which is good exercise. And the elevator lobbies are remote and the stairs are prominent and attractive and so on. I think stairs have a future.
They do.
These are two, there are two, there's.
You heard it here first, folks.
Absolutely.
This speaks to this question of public health and how we design opportunity for easy physical activity for everyone as much as they're capable of at any time, while we're still providing the support that's needed for people who have restricted mobility and are otherwise vulnerable. So you can do both at the same time, and it's not an either or, and it really does come down to design and the quality of the design and encouraging those who are able to be as physically active as possible just in the course of going about their day-to-day business.
And even things like stacking the closets in a townhouse or something like that allows for, in the future, as people are aging, to potentially, they can now put in a residential individual unit elevator. And yes, it adds cost, but for a lot of folks, that's cheaper than moving to a
we just
community.
bought a house in Seattle which has an elevator, and I thought, what a joke, we don't need an elevator. It turns out it's really useful for, moving furniture, for carrying heavy loads up and down, and as we get older, I think we're gonna be glad we have it.
I'd like to shift to the affordable housing question, and two of the key issues. I've built about 2,000 units of affordable housing, and 2 issues are in my mind, the most important. Number 1 is building walkable urban places where you can take at least 1 car out of the household budget. The AAA tells us that it's about $9,200 per year to own, operate, service, pay off the loan for park, and the smallest part of car ownership is gasoline. That's what people focus on, but that's the smallest part. So $9,200 per year, which of course is after-tax dollars. You convert that into a mortgage at 4% cost of money, not at what it is today, which is under 3%, you would increase your mortgage capacity by $150,000 for 1 car. So that's why the social equity metrics that Brookings and George Washington University have been doing demonstrates that these walkable urban places are more socially equitable because you have shifted household spending from a depreciable asset, a car, to generally an appreciable asset, a house, where you can build wealth. So that's number 1. But number 2 is a much bigger factor, and it's the land value under your house. We didn't have an affordable housing problem 30, 40 years ago in the drivable suburban era, because land under a house should be, rule of thumb, 18 to 20% of the house price is the improved value of the land underneath it. So when you would get your insurance, your property insurance, you only insure the 80% that are sticks and bricks because land does not burn. Today, in most walkable urban places, the land value is between 40 and 80% of what you're buying. And that's purely artificial inflation based upon political decisions that says we can only build walkable urban stuff on 2% of most metropolitan area land. That's why I said earlier, we've got to get the legally zoned land up to 5 to 7%, flood the market with walkable urban land, drive down the price of land. And the only people that you're going to hurt are the land speculators. You know, screw them.
True, true, true. Hey, by the way, on the parking, on our bike ride yesterday, a very wonderful tour, we passed a house that had a 4-car garage. A new house, just built. Not a very big house, 4-car garage. Hello?
Can I also add to this? I think a lot of these discussions talk about the number of units, but we also want to think about the number of people housed. And so, you know, a 1- and 2-person household, 3 one-person households with good design and the appropriate kind of unit could be a single household with 3 single people living together, which they have their own entries perhaps, or private bathrooms and so forth. So the ways in which we can rethink the units we count versus the people we house comfortably and well, I think is an important design part of this equation in all settings.
And that, of course, goes back to the fact that we baby boomers, it's all about us. And so we are now obviously in 1- and 2-person households. And when you look at the future demographic growth in this country, only 16% of household growth are families with children. 16%. The other 84% are singles and families, or singles and couples. So
That's why I think ADUs are important. Minneapolis now allows what, up to 4 per lot? Portland's up to 4.
that's part of the upzoning that we need.
Yeah, I think ADUs have a big future.
We had another question, and that question from the audience was, how do you retrofit a suburb with activity centers in various places? In other words, you grow out from a core, do you connect these various activity centers, and if you do that, how do you do it?
Your Midtown is wonderful.
Well, I think one way to look about this, when Ellen and I obviously have studied dozens of case studies in depth, and hundreds we've looked at and tried to categorize. Yes, many hundreds. And I think one of the things that we can say is that there isn't a neat, clean solution for every case. And so the answer was always, it depends. And I think some suburban communities might have a historical center or core, and if it's transit served, that certainly is the right place to start, and then perhaps build out kind of incrementally from there. Or it could be that there's a major corridor somehow that goes through the suburbs that might have a series of strip malls or strip centers that represent opportunity to begin to restructure into a series of stringed and connected nodes, and maybe it's bus that later becomes other kinds of transit that then create kind of opportunities there. And broadly speaking, these retrofits don't take away or change established single-family residential neighborhoods, right? That mostly stays in place, and that's something that we have to figure out what we're going to do with those places. But taking this kind of underutilized, already developed commercial property and restructuring and placing things there is the way to go. So ultimately, it's going to be somewhat multi-centered, I think, with pieces of different size and scale. And then you can differentiate them. So one might have more jobs and workplaces in it. Another might have more shops and restaurants. All of them can and should have housing, different types of housing than what already exists in the suburb.
I'd like to ask Michael Lykoudis, spent many years up in South Bend at Notre Dame. How South Bend does not have a lot of tax resources as a city. How do you retrofit a city like South Bend, a medium-sized Midwestern city that has a traditional downtown, but yet has lots of sprawl in the periphery as well?
Yeah, well, years ago, we started a downtown urban design center. And one thing we looked at is where is the natural center of the town? We polled citizens of South Bend. We brought business leaders, some of the homeless people. I mean, it was fairly extensive charrette. And we produced a plan that really divided the South Bend into various sort of districts. There was the civic core, there was the sports complex, but all of them had housing and mixed use. They all had purpose beyond that specific function. We tried to make use of the natural landscape. Notre Dame's kind of up on a hill, and there are several other intermediate stages, and there was a kind of a restaurant student area. There was an island in the river that was an entertainment district. And we also dealt with the transportation, so that the initial baby steps were a tram from the airport to the mall, which was east-west, and north-south, Notre Dame, down to the downtown. And eventually the plan was that there would also be a circular kind of a beltway of tram service. But that wasn't the main purpose of our program. But the other thing was to look at the neighborhoods and see where can each neighborhood have a node. It's very much like what you've done. And we got into the western suburbs a little bit. We didn't do the most egregious suburbs in the northeast, but we got to the western suburbs.
The South Shore line is a commuter rail from South Bend into Chicago, and I know that a lot of money was invested into that line recently. How is that working out? And who uses that rail line?
I think that's a very good question. It gets a lot of use. I think it is, when I compare South Bend in Chicago to New Haven and New York, and the service that Metro North provides is far superior. I mean, first of all, it's faster, it's more comfortable, and it's smooth. I mean, the whole experience is better. There have been promises to speed up the service on the South Shore and to eliminate some stops. There's some social equity issues there, but I think an express service would certainly help the relationship between Chicago and South Bend have a greater rapport. There's an Amtrak service out of Niles, but that's iffy sometimes.
Michael mentioned the word charrette. I don't know if you all realize it, but charrettes are only 35 years old. We did the first one at the University of Washington 35 years ago, and I've since been involved in about 30, and I know many of you have been involved in them, but they're typically 4 or 5 day workshops, and they've had, I think, a major impact on urbanism, charrettes. So let's keep going with those. You have done some, for sure, and I think everybody here has done.
I'd like to go back to something that June said, that much of this morning's conversation has been focused on, in my little 4-cell matrix in the upper left-hand corner, high-density, mixed-use, regionally significant walkable urban places like where we are here. And they're certainly crucial in the urbanizing suburb. But June pointed out something that is a real low-hanging fruit, and that's corridors. So it's both a cores and corridor strategy. And the corridors, which are strip malls primarily, or one-story office buildings that are now obsolete, they can become high-density housing, local serving, walkable urban places. That can probably, that's probably 60%, 70% of the new residential that's being demanded. And those corridors can have transit naturally, streetcars or otherwise, going up and down them. So I would, that's the other low-hanging fruit that's really easy.
You know the corridor project by Calthorpe from San Francisco down to San Jose?
El Camino Real.
Yeah, I think, what is it, over 1 million people?
45 miles and an assumption that you'd get about, they would be able, if you simply on that corridor rezoned for mixed use along all the strip malls, and built only up to about 3 stories.
Yeah.
At 3 stories, you would still be able to solve San Francisco's housing crisis for the next 40 years. And by putting in autonomous shuttle buses running up and down the corridor, because those new 250,000 homes would not need to own
You're
a
right,
car.
it's bus-based, isn't it?
Autonomous shuttle bus.
Autonomous, now, those autonomous vehicles will work, because they're in dedicated
those
right-of-way.
Those do.
Dedicated right-of-ways.
They do once you don't need a driver. Currently, it costs $350,000 per one, plus you're still paying for a driver. You might as well just have a shuttle bus without the autonomous, because you can buy the shuttle bus for $50.
And the thing is that amount of land being upzoned from strip mall to 3-story, it's about no more than 2% of the mid-peninsula. So it's a token amount of land, and you solve the affordable housing problem.
And
but the
Chris
folks
Nelson multiplies those numbers by now saying, the entire U.S. has enough. If you only rebuilt on 25% of the existing surface parking lots, we would solve the whole country's housing
we do not have a shortage of
crisis.
land. Keep in mind that Metro Washington is 1/2 the size in population of Metro Paris, but it's 4 times bigger in land mass. So it is built at a density of 1/8 that of Paris. And I don't think anybody's feeling sorry if you have to live in Paris at 8 times the density.
Yeah,
on
and by the
average.
way,
we have no shortage of land.
Paris has
Speaking of
6 and
affordability, we have one final question. Let me throw it out there. And this question is from the audience, and it involves it recognizes the importance of green space in urban areas, particularly when we have, we're not talking about lawns and people's houses, but we're talking about denser areas like the one we're in. And as it relates to affordability, to the extent that they recognize how important it is we build these green spaces, but how does that impact affordability and existing neighborhoods as you try to build these urban squares and green spaces within the urban area?
I think the question actually, what's really interesting, the trend we're seeing is that as you're retrofitting the suburbs, absolutely, you're putting in green spaces, but they're generally 1, maybe 2 acres. These are fairly small. The town green, it might be, Midtown Plaza here is even less than an acre.
tiny.
They often are AstroTurf. They may not, what people in the suburbs generally don't need a park because they need access to leafy green. They need a park to have access to other people. And so it's the programmed parks, putting in the LED screen that can broadcast all the local sports teams' games, that can have programming for moms and toddlers in the mornings and after school.
The food
kids.
truck.
It's the food trucks, the yoga classes, it's the programmed small parks are the big trend. And yes, you still need the beautiful, like Central Park in Carmel. You still need traditional parks for active recreation. But in the redevelopments, that combination of having, if you have a well-designed and well-programmed park, and it's the management of the programming that's really, really key
It's all
for those to
management.
succeed.
All management. Sorry, all you architects.
Now, we need to also talk about street trees.
But that's,
I got a whole
the
chapter.
trees add a huge part.
Yeah, I mean, street trees, I have a whole chapter on them. They really cool cities off, and they provide lots of other amenities. And I don't know how you're doing on street trees here.
There's always room for more.
Yeah.
And they can also contribute when you're remaking any kind of corridor and you want to restructure the amount of paved area given to cars. You want to add provision for transit, for biking. You can also better handle the stormwater and put in some permeable green space in those corridors as well. And so thinking about the opportunity to make the whole landscape system services perform better in suburbs, even while you urbanize or densify them. And that's kind of the neat trick, is that you can regreen and densify at the same time. And so some of these strip malls, they often were built on wetlands or other kinds of areas that didn't already have housing in them. And so all kinds of damage over the past half century has been done to the more regional kinds of watershed and other sorts of things. So putting that in at the same time is really, really important.
To follow up on that, we're doing a project where we're actually had some under parking lot stormwater storage, and now we don't need the parking lot because we have a structure. We've sold that land and putting up townhomes and condominiums, stacked flats within about a block of where we are, but we needed a place to put that water. So we bought 4 older industrial buildings within a couple blocks, are running the water into that area. But, you know, to the public, it's gonna look like a park. It's really a detention pond with beautiful gardens around it, but to the public, it's going to be a park. Do you see that happening in suburban areas often?
Absolutely. The stormwater parks are one of my favorites. They're super cool.
The key, one of the interesting things about stormwater parks is that they're designed to flood and get wet and mushy when it rains. And sometimes when they're understood and sold to the neighbors as recreational parks, people get grumpy then when they're mushy and muddy. And so the part of that is an educational thing. Like, that's how they're designed to be when it rains, and you should be happy that it's like that, because then it's doing this service for you. And so once people are used to that, they can even tell their children, oh, I know it's muddy, but that's because that park is taking care of all of us, right? And when it's drier, in a day or two, you can go back and play ball together there again. So there is a kind of community education component to this, that things that people have been frustrated with or think, well, that's just bad park design. In fact, that is good park design that's doing 2 things at once, and isn't that amazing?
And some of the stormwater parks are actually really built as bathtubs, and they are a pond, but it's down about 15 feet below the land surface. And these are generally for sewer overflow issues and things. We have one in Atlanta. It's essentially a sewer project, and I've seen weddings held at it. It is so beautifully designed. It is such an asset to its community, and it cost less to have it as this open air pond than a tunnel underneath parking lots.
So this sort of is kind of I think a summary point of what we're talking about, which is when you do walkable urbanism, you should start this upward spiral of value creation. And for every one thing you invest in, you better get 2, 3, 4 benefits. If you're just getting one benefit, you're probably doing it wrong. And you've just demonstrated that with parks that could also be.
Let us not forget that walkable urbanism, as important as it is not the whole solution to climate change. We have to deal with a lot of other issues. Our kids are in for a tough lifestyle. Our grandkids are in for a hell of a ride. We have really got to be aggressive in addressing climate. And Americans, of course, have a 40% bigger eco footprint or a carbon footprint, however you want to measure it, than Europeans who live very well. I mean, we're the problem, Americans. So let's get at it.
With that, I want to thank our panelists. It was a great discussion. Let's give them a round of applause.